The contraction hit me at exactly 9:47 in the morning, and I remember the time because I was staring at the digital clock on the conference room wall, trying to focus on anything other than the three faces across the table from me. Marcus Thorne, the CEO, was leaning back in his leather chair with his hands folded over his stomach in that satisfied way he had, the way a man leans back after a good meal. To his right was Brielle Vance, head of operations, 28 years old, blonde, wearing the kind of blazer that costs more than most people's rent, and smiling at me with the small, polite smile of a woman who had been waiting 6 months for this exact moment. To his left was Camila Reyes, VP of Marketing, my direct supervisor, the woman who had hired me 4 years ago, the woman who had cried at my baby shower 3 weeks earlier, the woman who was now refusing to make eye contact with me because she knew exactly what was about to happen. Marcus said, "Adelaide, we need to talk about restructuring." That was the word he used. Restructuring. Not firing. Not laying off. Restructuring. The way you'd describe rearranging furniture. The way you'd describe a small inconvenience that everyone in the room was going to pretend was something other than what it was. Welcome back to the channel, where the people who underestimated us always pay the price in the end. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that does not end the way they thought it would. My name is Adelaide Crow, and on the morning of October 14th, 8 months pregnant with my first child, sitting in a conference room at Thorne Vance Marketing, I was fired in the most calculated, humiliating way 3 people had ever fired anyone. And 3 years later, I walked back into that same conference room and I bought the entire company out from under them. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the story really starts. Let me start with what they took from me before they took my job. I joined Thorne Vance 4 years before that morning. I was 29 years old, freshly out of a graduate program, with a portfolio full of the kind of work that gets you noticed but does not yet pay the bills. Camila Reyes interviewed me. She was 41 then, sharp-eyed, with a laugh that surprised her every time it came out. She offered me the job over coffee in a small cafe near the office, and she told me with absolute sincerity that she was building a team of women who were going to change the industry. I believed her. I was 29, and I believed almost everything anyone told me, and Camila Reyes told me that morning that I was exactly the kind of person she had been waiting to find. I started 2 weeks later. I worked 60 hours a week for the first 18 months. I built campaigns that won awards. I brought in 3 of the firm's biggest clients, including a national skincare brand whose account, single-handedly, accounted for almost 20% of the firm's annual revenue. I was promoted twice. I was given a corner office. I was told by Camila, by Marcus, by everyone who mattered, that I was on the partnership track, that within 2 years I would be a name on the door, that the future of Thorne Vance was being built on the work I was doing. I met my husband, Theo, in the 3rd year of my time at Thorne Vance. He was a structural engineer, quiet, with hands that always smelled faintly of pencil graphite from the sketches he still preferred to draw by hand. We married 11 months after our first date in a small ceremony at his parents' farm in Vermont. His mother made the cake. His father walked me down the aisle because my own father had passed away when I was 22, and I had no one else to do it. It was the second happiest day of my life. The happiest came 9 months later, when the test on my bathroom counter showed 2 pink lines, and I sat on the edge of the tub and cried for 20 minutes before I could even tell Theo. We had been trying for 6 months. I was 33 years old. I had a career that was about to peak. I had a husband I adored. And now I was going to have a baby, and the universe, for the first time in my life, felt like it was finally giving me everything. I told Camila first. Not Marcus, not HR Camila. I sat across from her in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I told her I was 8 weeks pregnant, and I watched her face do something I did not have the experience then to read correctly. She smiled. She stood up. She came around the desk and hugged me. She said, "Adelaide, this is wonderful. We are going to take such good care of you." That was the word she used. Care. The way you'd talk about a houseplant. The way you'd talk about something you owned. I did not notice it then. I was 33 and pregnant and crying in my boss's arms, and I could not see what was already moving in the room around me. The small invisible adjustments being made to a future that just 30 seconds earlier had still belonged to me. The first sign came 2 weeks later. Camilla called me into her office and told me, with great warmth and concern, that she was reassigning the skincare account to Brielle Vance. Brielle had been at the firm for less than a year. Brielle was 27. Brielle was, not coincidentally, Marcus Thorne's niece, the daughter of his sister, brought into the firm as a favor and given a title that did not match her experience, because the firm's name had her family's name in it. Camilla explained that Brielle needed the experience. Camilla explained that I was about to go on maternity leave anyway, and that it would be easier on the client to have a single point of contact through the transition. Camilla explained that this was just a temporary arrangement and that the account would come back to me when I returned in 12 weeks. I believed her. I was 33 years old and pregnant and tired, and I believed her because I had spent 4 years believing her. And the cost of disbelieving her, in that moment, was more than I knew how to calculate. The second sign came a month later. The Patterson account, a regional restaurant chain I had brought in 18 months earlier, was reassigned to a junior account manager named Trevor, who could not, at that point in his career, have managed a coffee order without supervision. Camilla explained that this was about distributing my workload so I could focus on transitions before my leave. The third sign came 6 weeks before my due date, when I was removed from the agency-wide creative review meetings without explanation. The fourth sign came 4 weeks before my due date, when I noticed that my name had been removed from the firm's website. The fifth sign came 2 weeks before my due date, when I overheard Brielle Vance in the break room telling another junior employee that she was managing the skincare account permanently now, and that Adelaide isn't really coming back. Just so you know. I went home that night and I told Theo. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Addie, I think they are setting you up." I told him he was being paranoid. I told him I had worked there for 4 years, that I had built half of what they were now selling, that they would not, could not do this to me. I was 33 years old, and I still believed that loyalty was a transaction that worked in both directions. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. But I did not know it yet. I would not know it for another 9 days. The morning of October 14th, I drove to work in the dark. I was 8 months pregnant. I had been having Braxton Hicks contractions for 3 days. My back hurt in a way that no amount of stretching could fix. I had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks. But it was a Tuesday, and I had a client presentation at 11, and I was not the kind of woman who called in sick when I had work to do. I parked in my usual spot in the underground garage. I rode the elevator to the 7th floor. I waved hello to the receptionist, a kind woman named Doreen who had been at the firm longer than anyone else, and who, I would only realize later, gave me a strange, sad look as I walked past her desk. I went to my office. I set down my bag, and there, sitting on my desk, was a folded piece of paper with my name written on it in Camilla's handwriting. The note said, "Conference room A, 9:30 a.m. Marcus and I would like to speak with you." That was it. No explanation, no agenda, just 2 sentences at a time. I sat down at my desk. I read the note 3 times. Then I put it in my drawer, and I worked on the client presentation for 90 minutes. And I told myself, the way you tell yourself things you do not want to be true, that this was probably nothing. A check-in, a discussion about my leave, a conversation about transitions. I was 33 years old, and I still wanted to believe that the people I had worked beside for 4 years were not capable of what they were about to do. I walked into conference room A at exactly 9:28. 2 minutes early. The way I had always been 2 minutes early to everything in my life. The small habit of a woman who had been raised by a single mother to believe that punctuality was a form of respect. The door was already open. The lights were on, and the 3 of them were already seated, which told me the moment I crossed the threshold that this meeting had started before I arrived. They had been talking. They had been preparing. They had positioned themselves deliberately on one side of the long table, leaving the chair across from them empty. The chair where I was supposed to sit. The chair that had been pulled out and angled in a way that made it clear it was meant for one person, and that person was me, and that I was not in this room on the same side as anyone else. Marcus stood up when I came in. Camilla did not. Brielle smiled. I sat down. I placed my hands on top of my belly, the way pregnant women do without thinking. The small, protective gesture that had become as automatic as breathing in the past few months. Marcus said, Adelaide, thank you for coming. We have something difficult to discuss. That was when the contraction hit. It was a real one, not a Braxton Hicks. It started low in my back and wrapped around to the front, and it tightened my belly until I could feel my son kicking against the pressure, and I had to focus very hard on keeping my face still, because I knew, with absolute clarity, that if I showed any sign of pain in that moment, the 3 people across from me would use it as evidence that I was unfit to be in the room. So I breathed. I counted backward from 10. I waited for it to pass, and while I waited, Marcus began to speak. He talked for almost 6 minutes without stopping. He used the word restructuring 4 times. He used the phrase difficult decision twice. He used the word unfortunately once, and he said it with the small, performed regret of a man who had practiced the word in front of a mirror. He explained that the firm was moving in a new direction. He explained that the skincare account had decided, after working with Brielle for the past several months, that they wanted to continue with her permanently. He explained that the Patterson account had similarly transitioned. He explained that given these changes, my role at the firm no longer made business sense. He explained that they were terminating my position, effective immediately, and that I would receive 2 weeks of severance pay, which was the legal minimum, and that I should clear out my office by the end of the day. He did not mention my pregnancy. He did not mention the maternity leave I was supposed to start in 3 weeks. He did not mention the 4 years of work, the awards, the clients, the partnership track. He talked about restructuring, and then he stopped, and he folded his hands on the table, and he waited for me to react. I looked at Camilla. She was looking at the table. She had not made eye contact with me once since I had walked into the room, and she did not make eye contact with me now. I looked at Brielle. Brielle was looking directly at me, and she was smiling, the small, polite smile of a woman who had won something she had been wanting for a very long time, and who could not, quite, hide her satisfaction. I looked at Marcus. Marcus was watching my face, calculating the way a man watches a stock ticker. I said, I am 8 months pregnant. Marcus said, We are aware of that, Adelaide. This is not about your pregnancy. This is a business decision. I said, You are firing a pregnant woman 3 weeks before her maternity leave. Marcus said, We are restructuring a position that is no longer viable. The timing is unfortunate, but the decision is not based on your personal circumstances. I said, This is illegal. Camilla finally looked up. She said, Adelaide, please, don't make this harder than it has to be. We've been very fair. 2 weeks of severance is more than we are required to give you. I stared at her. 2 weeks of severance was the exact legal minimum. There was nothing extra. There was nothing fair. There was only the precise, calculated minimum that 3 people had decided, in a room I had not been invited to, was the price of erasing me from a company I had helped build. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I did not cry in that room, in front of those 3 people, because I had spent 33 years learning that women who cry in professional settings are women who have given the people across the table from them a weapon. And I was not going to hand them one more thing. I stood up. I felt my son shift inside me. The small turning that he had been doing for weeks. The small reminder that I was not just standing up for myself, that I was standing up for the both of us. I said, I would like a copy of the termination paperwork in writing, with the legal justification clearly stated, before I leave the building today. Marcus said, Of course. HR will provide everything you need. I said, I would also like the names of every person who was involved in this decision, in writing, for my records. Marcus's face did something I had not seen it do before. A small flicker. A recalculation. He said, "Adelaide, I don't think that is necessary." I said, "I do." I walked out of the conference room. I walked down the hallway, past the offices of people who would later claim, every one of them, that they had not known what was happening, that they would have spoken up if they had only known. I walked past Doreen at the reception desk, who looked up at me with tears in her eyes and mouthed, "I am so sorry." I walked into my office. I closed the door. I sat down in my chair. And then finally, with the door closed and no one to see, I let myself feel what had just happened. But here is the thing I want you to understand. The thing that matters about that moment. The thing that would matter for the next 3 years and for the rest of my life. I did not cry. I sat in my office for 10 minutes with my hands on my belly and my eyes closed, and I did not cry. I breathed. I felt my son move. I felt the contractions, smaller now, settling into a slower rhythm. And somewhere inside me, in a place I had not known existed until that morning, something cold and clear and absolutely steady began to take shape. It was not anger. Anger is hot. Anger is loud. What I felt in that office, with the door closed and the morning light coming through the window and my son turning slowly inside me, was something colder than anger. It was clarity. It was the clarity of a woman who had just seen, for the first time, exactly who the people in her life really were. And it was the clarity of a woman who had decided, in that 10-minute silence, that she was not going to spend the rest of her life being a story those people told at dinner parties about a junior employee they had to let go. I opened my laptop. I did not start packing my office. Not yet. Instead, I opened my email. I opened the cloud drive where I had, over 4 years, saved every project I had worked on, every campaign brief, every client communication, every internal memo. And I began very calmly to download. I downloaded the files I had created, the files I owned legally, under the terms of the work I had done as a salaried employee, the files that were not proprietary to the firm but that documented, beyond any possible dispute, the work I had personally done and the value I had personally created. I downloaded them to a personal drive. I encrypted them. I closed the laptop. Then I opened my email one more time, and I sent a single message to my personal email address. The subject line was notes. The body of the email was a list, names, dates, conversations, things I had observed in the past 6 months that, at the time, I had dismissed as paranoia. Brielle's comment in the break room, the reassignment of accounts, the removal of my name from the website, the pattern, which I could now see with absolute clarity, of a coordinated effort to push me out of the firm in a way that would minimize the firm's legal exposure while maximizing my professional damage. I sent the email. I closed the laptop. Then I started packing my office. It took me 40 minutes to pack 4 years of my life into 2 cardboard boxes. The framed photograph of Theo on our wedding day. The small ceramic mug my mother had given me when I got the job. The award certificates, which I almost left behind, and then took down from the wall, because they had my name on them and because I was not going to leave anything behind that could be repurposed by the people who had just done this to me. I left the plants. I left the office supplies. I left the stack of business cards in the top drawer of my desk, the cards with the title VP of Brand Strategy under my name, the cards I had been so proud of when they were first printed. I carried the boxes to the elevator. I rode down to the lobby. I walked past the security guard, a man named Kenny who had always been kind to me, who looked at me with my pregnant belly and my 2 cardboard boxes, and who did not ask, because he did not need to ask what had just happened. He said, "You take care of yourself, Ms. Crow." I said, "Thank you, Kenny, you too." I drove home. I did not call Theo. I did not call my mother. I drove home in silence, and I parked in the driveway of the small house Theo and I had bought 8 months earlier. The house we had picked because it had a yard for the baby, the house we could just barely afford because we had stretched ourselves to the edge of our budget on the assumption that I would be returning to my full salary after maternity leave. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. I watched the leaves on the maple tree in the front yard turn slowly in the October wind. I felt my son move, and I made 3 decisions, sitting in that driveway with the engine off and the windows up, that would change the next 3 years of my life. The first decision was that I was not going to sue them. This may sound strange. They had given me a clear, documented case for wrongful termination. Any employment lawyer would have taken it on contingency. I would have won. The settlement would have been substantial. But a lawsuit would have taken 3 to 5 years to resolve. A lawsuit would have left me in the public record as a woman who had been fired and had sued her employer, a label that would have followed me through every job interview for the rest of my career. A lawsuit would have given Marcus and Camilla and Brielle exactly what they expected from me, the predictable response of a woman who had been wronged. And I had decided, somewhere between the conference room and the driveway, that I was not going to give them anything they expected. The second decision was that I was going to have my baby. I was going to have my baby, and I was going to be present for the first months of his life in a way that I would not have been able to be if I had still been working at Thorne Vance. They had given me, without meaning to, the one thing I had quietly wanted but had been too afraid to ask for: time with my son. Real time, months of it. I was going to take that time. I was going to use it. And while I was using it, I was going to plan. The third decision was the one that would matter most. The third decision was that I was not going to get even with Marcus Thorne and Camilla Reyes and Brielle Vance. Getting even is what small people do. Getting even is a transaction. Getting even ends. I was not going to get even. I was going to do something else. I was going to build something so large, so undeniable, so completely outside of the world they thought they controlled, that one day, 3 years from that morning, I would walk back into that conference room not as a victim, not as a former employee, not as a woman seeking justice. I would walk back in as the person who owned the building they were standing in. I would walk back in as the buyer, and I would do it without ever raising my voice. My son Wilder was born 11 days later, at 4:17 in the morning on a Saturday in late October. The labor was long, almost 22 hours, and somewhere around hour 14 I remember thinking, in the strange clear way you think during pain, that the contractions did not feel any worse than the morning in conference room A. That morning had taught me something about my own threshold. I could survive things I had not known I could survive. I could keep my face still while the world rearranged itself around me. I could breathe through what was happening to my body and continue to make decisions with my mind. By the time Wilder was placed on my chest, slick and red and screaming with the small, fierce outrage of a person who had just been pulled into a world he had not asked to enter, I was already a different woman than the one who had walked into that conference room. I just did not yet know how different Theo was beside me. He had not slept in 2 days. His hand was bruised from where I had gripped it during the worst of the pushing. He looked at our son, and then he looked at me and he said very quietly, "Addie, we are going to be okay." I knew what he meant. He meant the money. He meant the house. He meant the medical bills that were already accumulating and the disappearance of my income and the slow erosion of the budget we had built around the assumption that I would return to work. He meant that he was going to figure it out. That he was going to take double shifts at the firm if he had to. That we were going to survive this, even if survival was all we managed for a while. I looked at him. I looked at Wilder. I said, "We are going to be more than okay, Theo. I promise you. We are going to be more than okay." He did not understand then what I meant. He thought it was the exhaustion talking. He thought it was the postpartum hormones. He kissed my forehead, and he held our son, and he did not press me. But I meant it. I meant every word. And in the months that followed, in the small dark hours when Wilder was nursing and the rest of the house was asleep, I began, very quietly, to build the thing that would prove me right. The first 6 weeks were the hardest. Not because of the baby. Wilder was an easy baby, the kind of baby who slept in 3-hour stretches and only cried when something was actually wrong. The hardest part was the silence. The silence of a phone that had once buzzed all day and now sat quiet on the kitchen counter. The silence of an inbox that had once received 200 emails a day and now received 3, all of them promotional. The silence of a professional identity that had been for 4 years the loudest thing in the room, and that was now reduced to the small sounds of a baby breathing in a bassinet beside my bed. I will not pretend I handled it gracefully. There were mornings I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee in my hand and stared at the wall for an hour before I could move. There were afternoons I held Wilder against my chest and cried into his small soft head while he slept, my tears wetting his hair, my whispered apologies for everything I had not yet been able to give him. Theo saw all of it. He did not try to fix it. He just made dinner and changed diapers and held me when I needed to be held and gave me space when I needed to be alone. And slowly, week by week, the silence began to feel less like a defeat and more like a clearing. Like a room that had been emptied so something new could be built in it. I started writing in the 7th week. Not on a laptop. On paper, in a yellow legal pad I found in a drawer of Theo's desk, with a black ink pen that scratched in the way old pens do. I wrote at the kitchen table while Wilder napped in the bassinet beside me. I wrote in the margins of grocery lists and on the backs of receipts. I wrote in the dark at 3 in the morning when Wilder was nursing, and my mind, no longer numb with grief, began to move again with the speed and clarity it had always had before. I wrote a business plan. Not a polished one. Not a pitch deck. A messy, sprawling, honest plan, the kind of plan you write when you are no longer trying to impress anyone, when you are only trying to figure out what is actually possible. The plan was simple. There were 3 things I knew. First, I knew that the marketing industry, in the city where I lived, was dominated by a small number of large firms, all of which operated on the same model that Thorne Vance operated on. The model of squeezing junior talent for 60-hour weeks while the partners took home the credit and the equity. Second, I knew that the best mid-level talent in the city, the women in their late 20s and early 30s who were doing 80% of the actual creative work at those firms, were burned out, underpaid, and 1 or 2 bad meetings away from quitting. I knew this because I had been one of them. I knew this because even in my 4 years at Thorne Vance, I had watched at least 6 women I respected leave the industry entirely after experiences not unlike mine. Third, I knew that the clients of those firms, the brand managers and marketing directors who were paying enormous fees for work that was increasingly mediocre, were quietly frustrated with the model, and that several of them, if approached the right way, would be willing to try something different. The plan I wrote on that yellow legal pad was for a marketing firm built differently. A firm that would hire mid-career women who had been pushed out or burned out of the big agencies. A firm that would offer them equity, not just salary. A firm that would charge clients on a value basis, not on the inflated hourly model the big firms use to justify their margins. A firm that would, by design, be smaller and faster and better than the firms it was competing against, because the people doing the work would be the people who actually owned the work. I had no money to start it. I had 2 weeks of severance, a small savings account, and a husband whose engineering salary was already stretched to cover our mortgage and our growing medical bills. But I had something else. I had a list. The list I had emailed myself on the morning of October 14th, the list of names and dates and conversations, had grown over the weeks into something larger. It had become a list of every contact I had made in 4 years at Thorne Vance, every client I had worked with, every freelancer I had collaborated with, every junior employee I had mentored, every vendor I had built a relationship with. 347 names by the time I finished compiling it. And every one of those names was a person who had reason to take my call. I made the first call when Wilder was 11 weeks old. I waited until he was napping. I sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where I had cried, 6 weeks earlier, into the top of his head. I dialed the number of a woman named Yolanda Pierce, who had been the brand manager at the skincare company whose account I had built and then lost. Yolanda picked up on the second ring. She said, "Adelaide. Oh my God, I have been thinking about you. I heard what they did. I am so sorry." I told her the truth. I told her I was starting something new. I told her I was not asking her to leave Thorne Vance, that I knew she had a contract and obligations, that I would never ask her to do anything that would compromise her position. I told her I was just calling to let her know that I existed, that I was building something different, and that when her contract with Thorne Vance came up for renewal in 17 months, I would like the chance to make her a proposal. Yolanda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Adelaide, I want to tell you something. The work the team has done since you left has been bad. Really bad. We have been losing market share. Brielle is in over her head, and Marcus is not taking my calls anymore. Tell me what you are building." "I am listening." That phone call lasted 47 minutes. By the end of it, Yolanda had agreed to be my first official client. On a small project basis, paid out of her department's discretionary budget so it would not require formal approval from her CEO. She was, in effect, hiring me on the side. The project was small, a brand refresh for a new product line, the kind of project that, at Thorne Vance, would have been billed at $60,000. I quoted her 22. She agreed before I finished the sentence. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table. I did not cry. I did not celebrate. I just looked at Wilder sleeping in the bassinet beside me, and I made a note on the yellow legal pad. First client. October 14th, deadline plus 84 days. 84 days from the morning they had told me I no longer made business sense. I had landed my first client, working from my kitchen table. With a baby asleep beside me and a husband at work and no office and no website and no business cards. The next day I made the second call. The first year was a blur. I will not pretend it was easy. There were months when the only person on the payroll was me, when I was negotiating contracts with one hand and pumping breast milk with the other, when I was taking client calls in the parking lot of the pediatrician's office because Wilder had an ear infection and I could not reschedule. There were nights when Theo found me asleep at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my face pressed against the keyboard. There were weeks when I made less than $1,000 and weeks when I made $20,000. And the unpredictability was its own particular kind of stress, the kind that you cannot complain about because you are the one who chose it. But the work was good. The work was the best I had ever done, because for the first time in my career, every decision I made was mine, and every dollar I earned was mine, and every client I served was a client I had personally chosen because I wanted to work with them. By the end of the first year, I had 11 clients. By the middle of the second year, I had 23, and I had hired my first 3 employees. All of them women I had worked with at Thorne Vance who had reached out to me quietly after hearing through the industry grapevine that I was building something. By the end of the second year, my firm, which I had named Crow Strategy because I was no longer interested in hiding behind a clever invented name, was generating annual revenue of just over $2 million, and I had, for the first time in my life, more business than I could handle. That was when I got the phone call from a man named Walter Ashby. Walter was 68 years old, semi-retired, and he had, 2 decades earlier, been one of the original investors in Thorne Vance Marketing. He was no longer actively involved in the firm, but he still held a substantial equity stake, and through that equity stake, he received quarterly financial reports. He had been watching for almost 2 years the slow decline of the firm, the loss of clients, the departure of senior staff, the drop in revenue. He had been asking Marcus Thorne with increasing frequency what Marcus was planning to do about it. And Marcus, who had built his career on telling investors what they wanted to hear, had been telling Walter for almost 2 years that everything was fine, that the firm was just going through a transition, that the numbers would turn around in the next quarter. The numbers had not turned around. The numbers had gotten worse. And Walter Ashby, who had heard about Crow Strategy through a mutual acquaintance, was calling me to ask if I would be interested in having a conversation about something he had been quietly thinking about for several months. I knew what he was going to ask before he asked it. I had been waiting for this call for almost 3 years. I just had not known until that moment that it would actually come. I said, "Walter, I would be delighted to have that conversation. When would you like to meet?" We met for breakfast at a small restaurant on the east side of the city, the kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who refilled your coffee without asking. Walter Ashby was already there when I arrived. He was a tall, thin man with white hair combed back from a high forehead, wearing a navy suit that looked like it had been tailored sometime in the previous century and had been kept in perfect condition ever since. He stood when I came to the table. He shook my hand with the firm, dry handshake of a man from a generation that still believed in handshakes. He said, "Adelaide, thank you for coming. I have been wanting to meet you for some time." We sat. The waiter brought coffee. Walter did not waste time on small talk, which I appreciated. He opened a leather portfolio on the table between us, and he took out a single sheet of paper, and he slid it across to me. He said, "This is the financial summary for Thorne Vance Marketing for the most recent fiscal quarter. I would like you to look at it before we continue." I looked at it. I had suspected, from the rumors I had been hearing, that the firm was struggling. I had not understood how badly. The numbers on that page were not the numbers of a struggling firm. They were the numbers of a firm in collapse. Revenue had dropped 43% over the previous 18 months. The skincare account, which Brielle had taken from me, had walked out the door 6 months earlier and signed with a competitor. The Patterson account had gone with them. 3 other major clients had not renewed. The firm had laid off a third of its staff in the past year. Marcus had taken out a personal loan against his equity stake to cover payroll for 2 consecutive months. Camila Reyes had quietly left the firm 4 months earlier, citing health reasons, though Walter mentioned, with the small dry smile of a man who knew more than he was saying, that her health had improved dramatically the moment she joined a competing firm in a senior consulting role. And Brielle Vance, who had been promoted to head of operations after my departure, was now running a firm that was, by every measurable standard, failing. I set the paper down. I looked at Walter. I said, "Why are you showing me this?" Walter took a sip of his coffee. He set the cup down. He said, "Adelaide, I am 68 years old. I am not interested in spending the rest of my life watching my investment in this firm dwindle to nothing. I have spoken with 2 of the other major equity holders. We hold collectively 61% of the firm. We have decided that we want out. Marcus does not know this yet. He will know it next week when we exercise the buyout clause in our partnership agreement, which will require him to either match our offer or release the firm to a buyer of our choosing." He paused. He looked at me, and the look was not the look of a kindly older man having breakfast with a younger woman. It was the look of an investor who had been doing his homework. He said, "I have been following Crow's strategy for the past 9 months. I have spoken with several of your clients. I have reviewed your financials, the public ones at least. I have spoken with 3 of your former colleagues, all of whom now work for you, and all of whom told me, without prompting, that you are the best leader they have ever worked for. I would like to offer you the opportunity to acquire Thorne Vance Marketing. The firm, the offices, the remaining client contracts, the brand, all of it, at a price that I think you will find very, very reasonable." I did not respond immediately. I sat with the offer. I let it move through me. 3 years earlier, I had been sitting in a conference room in that firm's offices, 8 months pregnant, being told that my role no longer made business sense. I had walked out with 2 cardboard boxes and 2 weeks of severance. I had built, in the years since, a company that had grown faster and stronger and more profitable than the firm that had thrown me away. And now the man across the table from me was offering me the chance to buy the firm that had thrown me away, at a price that he was already telling me would be favorable, before I had even responded to the offer. I said, "Walter, I am going to be honest with you. I have, for 3 years, imagined a version of this conversation. I had not, until this moment, allowed myself to believe it would actually happen. So I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it honestly." "Why me?" Walter smiled. It was a small, wry smile, the smile of a man who had been waiting to be asked the question. He said, "Adelaide, I have been in this industry for 40 years. I have watched 100 firms rise and fall. I have watched 100 founders make the same mistakes. The mistake Marcus made, the mistake that has cost him this firm, was not a strategic mistake. It was a character mistake. He underestimated a person who had built half of what he was selling, and he discarded her in a way that was both cruel and stupid. He did not understand that the talent he was firing was the talent that had built the firm. He thought the brand was the thing of value. He thought the offices were the thing of value. He thought the partnership names on the door were the thing of value. He was wrong. The thing of value was the people doing the work. And the moment he showed those people, by what he did to you, that they could be discarded as easily as you were, every one of them began to plan their exit. The firm has been dying for 3 years. It just took the bookkeeping a while to catch up. He paused. He took another sip of his coffee. He said, "I am offering you the firm because I believe you are the only person in this city who can rebuild it into something worth what we paid for it 20 years ago. And because, frankly, I would like to be a small part of the story when you walk back into that office as the owner. Old men like me have to get our entertainment somewhere." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed during the meeting. I said, "Walter, I would like to ask for a week to review the offer with my husband and my financial advisor." Walter said, "Take 2 weeks. I am not going anywhere, and neither is Marcus, though he does not know it yet." We finished our coffee. We shook hands again. I walked out of the restaurant into the bright winter morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 15 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. I did not cry. I did not call Theo. I just sat with what had just happened, and I let it become real, slowly, the way the sun becomes real on a cold morning, gradually filling every corner of the sky. The acquisition closed 11 weeks later. The price was, as Walter had promised, very reasonable. I funded it through a combination of my own retained earnings from Crow Strategy, a strategic investment from Walter himself, who took a small minority stake in the new combined entity, and a business loan from a regional bank that, 3 years earlier, would not have given me a credit card. The legal paperwork was finalized on a Tuesday in March. The transfer of operational control was scheduled for the following Monday. And the all-hands meeting, the meeting at which I would be introduced to the staff of Thorne Vance Marketing as their new owner, was scheduled for 9 o'clock that Monday morning. In conference room A, I want to tell you what I wore. I think it matters. I wore a charcoal suit, simply cut, expensive but not flashy. I wore the small gold earrings my mother had given me on my 30th birthday. I wore flat shoes because I had learned in 3 years of running a company while raising a child that comfort was not optional. I carried a leather briefcase that contained the signed acquisition documents, the new organizational chart, and a single sheet of paper on which I had written the night before the names of every person who had been involved in my firing on October 14th, 3.5 years earlier. Marcus Thorne, Camilla Reyes, Brielle Vance, 3 names, 1 sheet of paper. I drove to the building at 8:30. I parked in the underground garage in the spot that had, 3.5 years earlier, been my assigned spot. The number on the wall was the same. The paint was the same. I took the elevator to the 7th floor. The receptionist was no longer Doreen, who had retired the year before. The new receptionist was a young woman named Priya, who looked up at me with the polite, slightly nervous smile of a person who had been told that something significant was happening that morning, but had not yet been told what. I walked to conference room A. The door was open. The lights were on, and inside, seated around the long table, were the remaining senior staff of Thorne Vance Marketing. There were 11 of them. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the table, in the same chair he had sat in on the morning he had fired me, with his hands folded over his stomach in the same satisfied way. He had not yet been told what was happening. He thought this was a quarterly investor briefing. He thought he was about to give a presentation about turnaround strategy. He looked up when I came in. His face did something I had not seen it do in 3.5 years. It did the thing faces do when they are trying to recognize a person and rearrange the past at the same time. He said, "Adelaide?" His voice was uncertain. He half stood. He was trying to be polite. He was trying to figure out why I was there. Brielle Vance, who was sitting 2 chairs down from him, did not stand. She just stared at me, with the wide, frozen stare of a person who has just realized that a story she thought was over is actually just beginning. Camila Reyes was not in the room. Camila had left the firm a year earlier. I would deal with Camila separately. Today was for Marcus and Brielle. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit in the chair Marcus was standing beside. I stood. I placed my briefcase on the table. I opened it. I took out the acquisition documents. I set them on the table in front of Marcus. I said, Marcus, as of 9 o'clock this morning, Thorn Vance Marketing is owned by Crow Strategy. I am the sole owner of Crow Strategy. Walter Ashby and the other majority equity holders signed the transfer of ownership last Friday. You should have received the paperwork from your attorney over the weekend. I am told you did not open your email. That is unfortunate. But the transaction is complete. The room went silent. The 11 people at the table looked at me. They looked at Marcus. They looked at the documents on the table. Marcus's face did the thing faces do when a person is trying very hard to remember how to breathe. He sat down slowly in the chair he had been standing beside. He did not speak. Brielle made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a word, and then she stopped, because there was no word for what she was trying to say. I continued. I said, effective immediately, the firm will operate under new leadership. The name of the firm, going forward, will be Crow & Associates. The brand of Thorn Vance will be retired. I will be meeting individually, over the next week, with every member of the staff to discuss continued employment under the new structure. I want to be very clear. The vast majority of the staff will be offered positions in the new firm, with improved compensation, equity participation, and a culture that I believe most of you will find significantly more sustainable than what you have experienced in recent years. There are, however, 2 exceptions to that general policy. I looked at Marcus. I said, Marcus, your employment is terminated effective immediately. Your equity has been bought out at fair market value, which I am sure your attorney will explain to you was significantly less than you had hoped. You have until the end of the day to remove your personal belongings from your office. Security will assist you. I would prefer that you not return to the building after today. I looked at Brielle. I said, Brielle, your employment is also terminated effective immediately. You will receive 2 weeks of severance pay, which is the legal minimum. I considered briefly offering you more. I decided against it. I paused. I looked at her. I said, I have been told it is more than fair. Brielle's face went white. She understood. Of course she understood. Those were the exact words Camila had used to me, 3.5 years earlier, in this exact room. 2 weeks of severance. More than fair. The line had been delivered. The circle had been closed. Brielle stood up. She did not say anything. She walked out of the room. Marcus sat in his chair for almost a full minute, staring at the documents, before he too stood up and walked out, slowly, like a man walking through deep water. The door closed behind them. The room was silent. The remaining 9 people at the table looked at me, and I could see in their faces the slow dawning recognition of what had just happened. I sat down at the head of the table. I folded my hands. I said, I know this is a lot to absorb. I want you to know that I understand exactly what it is like to sit in this room and have your professional life rearranged without warning. I will not do that to any of you. Over the next week, I will meet with each of you personally to talk about your future at this firm. I want you here. I want to build something with you. And I want to tell you, before we go any further, that the firm we are going to build together will be a firm where what happened to me 3.5 years ago is not possible. Not because of policy, because of culture, because of who we choose to be. I paused. I looked around the table. I said, welcome to Crow & Associates. Let's get to work. I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was cold, because I needed to feel the air on my face. Theo had dinner waiting. Wilder, now 3 years old, was at the kitchen table coloring a picture of a dragon. He looked up when I came in. He said, Mama, you look happy. I said, I am happy, baby. Theo asked me how the meeting had gone. I told him. I told him every detail. He listened, the way he had listened for 3 years, without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, just present, just there. When I was finished, he poured me a glass of wine. He said, Addie, you did it. I said, "We did it." He shook his head. He said, "No, you did it. I just held the flashlight while you built it. That was 3 years ago now. The firm has tripled in size since the acquisition. We have offices in 2 more cities. Wilder will start kindergarten in the fall. I sit on the boards of 3 nonprofits that support women re-entering the workforce after pregnancy discrimination. I am writing this story down because someone asked me recently if I had any regrets. If, given the chance to go back to that morning in conference room A, I would have done anything differently. I thought about it for a long time, and the answer I came to is the answer I want to leave you with. No, I would not have done anything differently, because the woman I am today, the company I have built, the life Wilder gets to grow up inside of, none of it would exist if Marcus and Camilla and Brielle had not, on the morning of October 14th, decided that I was disposable. They handed me that morning the one thing I would never have been brave enough to take for myself. They handed me my freedom, and I took it. And I built something with it that they could not have imagined, because they were not capable of imagining a woman like me. If you are sitting somewhere right now, listening to this story, and you have just been handed your own version of that morning, I want you to hear me. The thing they took from you was never the thing of value. The thing of value was always you, and nobody, not Marcus, not Camilla, not anybody, can fire you from being the person you are. So get up, go home. Hold the people who love you. And then when you are ready, start building. The best revenge is not revenge. The best revenge is the life they did not believe you could have. Build it, brick by brick, and one day, you will walk back into the room they threw you out of, and you will own it. I promise you, you will own it.